At 149,000 ringgit, the BYD Atto 3 is not Malaysia's most affordable EV. However, with a unique battery cell technology under the floor and a reasonable powertrain, but most importantly backing by Sime Darby Motors, is this now the electric vehicle to beat? Or is it a little bit too Chinese? My name is AIMAN ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, and before we get into it, be sure to hit subscribe and hit the bell to be notified every time we make a new upload. But ladies and gentlemen, this is our review of the 2023 BYD Atto 3. Now before we get into it, we have to first talk about the powertrain. So the BYD Atto 3 is powered by a 205 or 210 PS electric motor with 310 Newton meters of torque powering the front wheels. There is obviously no gearbox because it's electric, and underneath the skin of this extended range model you will find a 60 kilowatt hour blade battery. Now, batteries don't normally have names, and even if they do, we don't mention them. But the reason why we're mentioning them is because, like I said, the battery technology in this car is unique, which we will talk about in the drive section later. Now, onto the bit that you want us to talk about, which is the design. Now, the Atto 3 from the outside looks very unassuming. While it might have this very nice satin silver blade here and full LED headlights with a light bar, and it might have some nice wheels and whatever, but for the most part, the Atto 3 is a little bit forgettable. Now, BYD always designed the Atto 3 to be a global model. And so in trying not to be offensive, there is a possibility that they've ended up going too far in the other direction and designing something bland. Now, on this extended range model, we get 18-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Atlas Batman tires. I'm not kidding. These are actually, weirdly, the same tires that you get on the Proton Saga, albeit the SUV variety. Now, you'll also notice the BYD design badge up here on the fender. You get that on the other side as well, but on the driver's side, it hides the charging ports. Now, for AC charging, this car charges up to 7 kilowatts, and for DC charging, it charges up to 80 kilowatts on the extended range and 70 kilowatts on the standard range. That means 0 to 80% can take about 45 minutes on an 80 kilowatt charger, which is not that bad. Now, the most remarkable thing about the side of this car is actually this. This panel here is designed to look like fish scales, apparently. Now, on the grey, it kind of disappears into the background, but on a contrast color, it does look rather good. The rear of the Atto 3 is slightly more successful, but only slight, mostly because of the light bar that goes from one end to the other, which I think looks very distinctive at night. You also get sequential indicators here, and you get pretty interesting sort of scaly type designs within the taillights. Now, overall, again, it still looks kind of meh, but what I find remarkable, and not in a good way, is the badge, because at the front it says BYD, on the wheels it says BYD, but on the back it says build your dreams. Now, I know what that means, I know what it stands for, and I think most people will understand it, because if you walk into a showroom, you are bombarded with marketing messages to let you know that BYD stands for build your dreams, but this is not nice. There has been a couple of BYD Atto 3 owners that have removed this badge and just reduced it to BYD, which I think is an excellent idea. Now, behind this rather naff sticker is the button that releases the tailgate. It goes up at a very leisurely pace, but once it goes up, you will find a pretty decent amount of space, actually. There's actually more room back here than you get in a Proton X50. Now, the boot floor is dual level, so you can actually raise it, so you have a flat load bay, or you can lower it and you have more cargo room. But as it stands now, the load lip is not that deep, but most importantly, as I said, there is plenty of space in here for things. You will also find this bag. Now, this bag contains not only the Type 2 to Type 2 charger, but also the vehicle to load system. Now the V2L system is pretty important to talk about because that is what allows you to use your BYD Atto 3 essentially as a very large power bank. So if you wanted to go camping, for example, you could charge up your Atto 3, drive into the jungle about as far as your two-wheel drive car will take you, and then use the V2L function to power a fan or a washing machine, which I reckon would be quite important when you're out in the stick. Now, as I mentioned, the exterior of this car as a whole is rather meh, but the interior is like a fever dream. Because when was the last time you saw a car at this price point have so many colors and so many swoops and creases, and I have no idea what's going on in here. Now, before we get into it, it is worth noting that everything that you see in here is not leather, it's actually plastic. But the fake leather on the seats and the fake leather on the dash and all that, this is all actually quite nice. And the use of multiple colors does mean that the interior looks more interesting than you'd expect at this price point. It's not all great though, because yes, the seats are very nice and there's lots of soft touch material, and it does for the most part feel like a more expensive car. But there are lots of places that unfortunately you do have to touch that will remind you of how affordable this is. So for starters, you have this nasty plastic around this aircon vent surrounds, and the vents themselves, when you move them left and right, they do feel a little bit cheap. And then of course you have the door pulls, which are very interestingly integrated into the tweeters. But the action of them does not feel particularly confidence-inspiring. I have a suspicion that at some point that's going to break. The other thing that I'm suspicious will break at some point is actually the center screen, because while it is a very large screen and actually the actions of it are all very nice, it's very smooth, the graphics are great, it responds relatively quickly, although booting does take a little bit of time. It also does this little thing where it switches from landscape to portrait, and then you can switch it back, and there's a button here, there's a button on the screen. And I just have a feeling that over a period of about 3 or 4 years with a jammy child in the front seat, because there are ISOFIX mounts up here so they can play with the screen if they're in a front mounted seat, that is going to break. And I feel like we are just waiting for a Facebook post of a BYD owner who says, "Oh no, my screen is broken," and it'll be at a little angle and it'll be really funny. I mean, it'll be really sad. Thank God the car's got a 5-year warranty. Now, aside from that center screen, you also get a driver's information display here, which is very, very small. But that's okay, because this screen displays exactly what you need it to. Compared to having a large display with lots of space and graphics that don't really fill it up, instead you have this very small but very pixel-dense screen, which tells you things like your speed, your range, your battery percentage, your brake regen, and whatever driving mode you're in, which I think is just right. Now, Tesla went a little bit too far in one direction by saying, you don't need this, you only need this. Nonsense. Drivers need a driver's information display because we drive. And so having this here is a great benefit. The other great benefit is the fact that BYD has resisted the urge of go away, stop talking, stop, shut up. The other great thing about this car, the brand of which I cannot mention because otherwise the voice assistant will pop up very irritatingly, is that they have resisted the urge of integrating all the buttons into the screen, because down here I have actual buttons for things like my front defroster, my blind spot information system, my parking sensors, everything is here. I even have my drive mode selector and even a volume rocker, which, I mean, I have one here, but I also have one here, which is really nice. I'm so glad that buttons are finally making a comeback. And you also get a wireless charging pad down here. Now, you also get a couple of cup holders, which are dual level. There's actually a little thing in here which you can remove if you have a longer cup, or if you have a shorter one, you can put this in here and put in a shorter cup so that it's much easier for you to access. You also have decently sized door bins which reveal the guitar strings, which I'm really not a fan of, because while in theory they can hold a larger item in here, in reality they can't, because the base of these door pockets are still very narrow. You do get ambient lighting in this extended range model. Now, the SR models only get a single color. The extended range models get multicolor ambient lighting with rhythmic pulses which pulse along to your music. So in case you are too old to go to a club, you can have one in your car, in your driveway. perhaps. The sound system, however, is not quite so successful. So this is a direct HD audio system, a brand of which I've never heard. I may be ignorant, but what I do know is that really isn't that punchy. Admittedly, I have just gotten out of a car with a Harman Kardon audio system, but I guess for the price it's all right, but I know I've seen better for about 150 grand, so maybe a little bit more tweaking. Back here though, things are a little bit better because yes, the seat base does seem a little bit too flat for my liking. I prefer it at an angle. I can, however, stretch out and then I get fantastic under thigh support. And there's lots of pockets back here, so I can put in a laptop and some cables and all sorts of other things, which is really nice. I also get a couple of knee coolers. I wouldn't call them rear aircon vents because while they do blow air conditioning out of them, you can't actually get the vent high enough to hit anything other than your knees, underneath which you will find a couple of USBs, one USB-A and one USB-C, and you also get a couple of cup holders here in the center armrest. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is an ISOFIX mount over the front seat. There are also ISOFIX mounts back here in the back seats, which means you can carry up to 3 children in here in seats. And if you have 3 children and 1 spouse, they can actually sit right here in the middle because this electric car has a flat floor, and because the children in these seats obviously will not have legs that require legroom, you can stretch out and put your feet in here, and then you have an excellent view out the front. Although that said, this extended range model also comes with a panoramic sunroof, which is really nice by inviting more light into this cabin, which with this rather weird color scheme does make the interior feel nice and bright and airy, which is great for kids and no doubt great for adults too. I really don't think I'd mind doing a long distance trip in this, although range might be a bit of a concern. But before we talk about whether or not this car can be taken long distance, I think we have to first drive it, yeah? Now the Atto 3 is a rather interesting vehicle to drive. Not just because it's electric, although as I'm sure regular viewers of the channel will know that I do have a soft spot for electric cars. No, the Atto 3 is interesting to drive because it is very distinctly Chinese. Now I say that because of the manner with which this car drives. So as I'm sure many of you would have known by watching a few other reviews, that the seats in this car are fantastic, but the suspension is also particularly soft. Now, this is something that the Chinese market like quite a bit. They love a soft ride, and that has a lot to do with the fact that the way they drive means that a softer suspension means that they have just a gentler, more comfortable experience. However, for Malaysian drivers, that's not so great. So when you're on the motorway heading in a straight line, then it's fine because it does soak up the lumps and bumps pretty well, at least the smaller ones. The trouble is, with the way our roads tend to undulate, it does mean that the Atto 3 tends to sort of hop a little bit. It doesn't settle as quickly as you'd expect. And as a result, it does mean that, and in very extreme circumstances, you can actually find yourself with the car kind of lifting off and reducing the amount of grip you get from the wheels. This could be a little bit hair-raising, particularly if you're the type to cruise on the motorway at very high speeds, although you shouldn't. And the other problem, of course, is that when you're on the motorway doing those high speeds that you're not supposed to, you will find that through the corners, the Atto 3 is not quite as confidence-inspiring. Again, largely down to that very soft suspension, because the body will lean and tilt quite considerably, especially when you take this car against other competitors within this segment, such as the Hyundai Kona EV, which is a car that we most certainly like quite a lot. Now, what that means is that when you're on the motorway, you have to be a little bit more gentle with this car. It is not the end of the world, in fact, far from it. Because when you do drive this car reasonably and you manage your expectations insofar as the ride, the Atto 3 is a perfectly acceptable car. In fact, when you're driving at about 110, wind and road noise is relatively well suppressed. Things only tend to get a little bit hairy when you creep past the national speed limit because, again, this is a very Chinese car. And the Chinese are not really big into speeding, and so their R&D tends to not account for people driving beyond 110 kilometers an hour. Now, unfortunately, Malaysians don't really drive at that speed, and then when you don't, you will realize that the Atto 3 suffers from quite a bit of wind and road noise. Now, wind noise, there's not really much that can be done because the aerodynamics of this car obviously are not something that you can change. But in terms of road noise, I suspect that a lot of that is down to those Atlas Batman tires I mentioned earlier. Because these are the same tires in essence as fitted on the Proton Saga, which is a very quiet car until you get it up to motorway speeds. And I suspect that that is where the crux of the noise of the Atto 3 comes from, the tires. Now, BYD earlier this week announced a change to, no, stop doing that. They actually announced a change to the tyre specifications for the Atto 3 in other markets, where it now uses Continentals of some variety. And I suspect that in doing so, not only would you increase grip and overall tyre performance, but you'd also probably decrease the amount of noise that enters the cabin. That is possibly something that you'd want to look at if you're buying one of these and you intend to use it longer term. Now, again, talking about longer term usage, and since I find myself in a traffic jam, we obviously have to talk about the advanced driver assist features, because naturally there will be quite a number of people buying this with the idea that, oh, it's a great town runabout, which it is. Now, this car does come with full level 2 semi-autonomy, which means it's got adaptive cruise control, lane keep assist, lane departure warning, blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, and of course, autonomous emergency braking with pedestrian and cyclist detection. Or is it just pedestrians? One of those things. Don't hit either. But in any case, that does mean that because this car is comprehensively equipped, it means that when you're stuck in traffic like this, you can let the car do the majority of the work. Now again, in traffic, this system does work relatively well. It's a little bit aggressive in how it accelerates and brakes, but the radar and camera system do a very good job at detecting obstacles from a good distance away, and they do a pretty good job of keeping you up to speed. The trouble arises, yet again, when you hit motorway speeds, because if you're thinking that this is as good a system as, say, Volvo's Pilot Assist, then you are sorely mistaken. Because at motorway speeds, it seems like the motor that runs the steering wheel adjustment doesn't quite have enough oomph to turn the wheel in a more progressive and confidence-inspiring manner. And as a result, it does mean that you will have to end up doing a little bit more work than you might necessarily expect. Again, the Hyundai Kona EV does a much better job at this, and for about the same price, you can get the Kona EV Plus, not the Max, the one in the middle, where you get all the goodies, but not the bigger battery. But again, if you're just driving in town, this car is fine because you won't really notice the wind noise or the road noise because you'll be doing less than 90 kilometers an hour anyway. And it is in town where I feel that the Atto 3 is at its strongest, because we need to talk about range. Now, there is a range disparity with this car because BYD in Malaysia claim, stop doing that. They claim that this car will do 480 kilometers on a single charge. This is based on the CLTC cycle, which is a Chinese testing cycle for their vehicles. Now, the CLTC cycle is not really representative of driving in any other country outside China, which means for the Atto 3, you are more realistically going to be looking at 420 kilometers, which is what this car is rated based on the WLTP cycle. Now, I got into this car expecting 420 kilometers, which is more than enough really for the money that this car is asking for, and with the battery size, which is only about 60 kilowatt hours, 420 is still pretty good. But having driven this car through traffic jams and doing, the urban crawl and that sort of nonsense, if you're driving at slower speeds, the Atto 3 can actually get up to 480 kilometers. Realistically, you're looking at about 450 to 470. But when you're on the motorway, that's when you can rely on the WLTP cycle's 420 kilometers estimated range. Because naturally, this car running a relatively small motor, only about 200 PS and about 310 Newton meters, obviously this little motor has to work very hard in order to keep this car up at speed. But again, if you're just driving it in town, you're fine. And driving it in town is where I found the Atto 3 to be the most rewarding, because these seats are very comfortable, the level 2 semi-autonomy is very reliable, and for the most part, this car has everything one would need. It's got a great audio system. I take back what I said earlier. This Dirac HD audio system is surprisingly good, again, for the money. You're not going to get the same kind of punch that you would in, say, a Harman Kardon 12-speaker audio system in a Volkswagen Arteon, but it's good for the money. And the fact that it's got all of this equipment that you need means that life in an Atto 3 is relatively peaceful, except for the lack of Android Auto. Now, of course, the company, the name of which I will not mention yet again because otherwise the assistant will pop up and interrupt me. The company does say that Android Auto is coming in Q3 of this year via an over-the-air software update. Android Auto, of course, is one of those things that everybody needs to use, or everybody does use, at least in this country, mostly for Waze and Spotify. But in the meantime, Apple CarPlay is already available, and of course, both of these technologies will be made available in the Atto 3 wirelessly, so it's not an extra cost, it's not a subscription. It will be coming to this car, and it will be made standard in due course. Now, the reason I bring that up is because I have a concern with regards to how it will be displayed on this enormous touchscreen. Now, I know that Apple CarPlay takes over the entire screen. Apparently it works very well and it looks pretty good and it's very good refresh rate. That's all great. I have a concern with Android Auto because we've seen Android Auto on Mercedes-Benz's MBUX systems not take up the entire width of the screen, and so I'm curious to see what BYD's implementation is here, because if it only takes up a portion of the screen, then it's going to look a little bit cheap and a little bit naff. And when you are spending in this extended range model about 180,000 ringgit for a car, that's not very nice. You know, although I do trust that BYD will make software adjustments, etc., in order to make it integrate better, but it's still an issue. So overall, what do I think of the BYD Atto 3? Well, for the money, it represents excellent value. And through the week that we've had this car, during which time it's been with myself and my Bahasa presenter Shasha, and if you want to look at if you would like to watch a Bahasa review of this car, you can check out her channel. We haven't been able to find a significant fault with this car. Now, my previous experiences with Chinese vehicles have always been very, very disappointing, largely because they make huge promises on paper and then they fail to deliver in reality, be it in terms of performance, fuel economy, overall build quality, or the overall package for that matter. But the BYD Atto 3 is a different stop it. The Atto 3 is a significantly improved vehicle and it is certainly doing a lot of work for other Chinese makers in this country, because more often than not, as we've seen according to data as well as through some testimonies that we've received from BYD staff, this car has attracted so much attention that even on a weekday, their showrooms are full. So more often than not, this is going to be the first electric Chinese car that a lot of people are going to be interacting with, and this therefore sets a very, very high bar in terms of quality and overall execution. Sure, there are some very Chinese idiosyncrasies, such as, for example, when I use the adaptive cruise control, it says ACC actived, not activated. And when you charge it, there's a little discrepancy with sort of where the comma is supposed to be and stuff like that, but they're very small. Overall, this car is excellent, and in fact, it presents itself better than a local car with Chinese content in it. I don't think I have to tell you what that car is. So, as far as I'm concerned, this is certainly a car that I could recommend, not only because it's excellent value, but it's also because it's a car that I would live with. The more I drive it around, the more I kind of want one, which means as I'm driving to their showroom now in order to hand this car back, I have a feeling that I'm going to be inquiring with regards to a discount. In any case, that's been our review of the BYD Atto 3. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so you're notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe and jangan bodoh.